My pleasure to welcome you to the session today. CBi was launched in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit, and this year marks our 5th anniversary. We've seen great progress over the years as more businesses have stepped forward to support disaster management, and private sector networks are increasingly recognized as a critical partner in supporting vulnerable populations. This week, CBi has organized 4 sessions to raise awareness and highlight good practices of how the private sector is contributing to disaster preparedness, response, and recovery in different contexts. Our first session yesterday focused on the humanitarian development peace nexus. Today, the session will focus on exploring private sector engagement in disease outbreaks and multi-hazard scenario planning. The other sessions organized at the same time tomorrow and Thursday focus on new technologies and gender considerations in disaster management. You'll hear from some of our networks and partners as they describe their engagement and suggest concrete ways to take this work forward. We hope you will find these sessions inspirational, and we look forward to staying in touch with you after this week as well. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the session moderator, Mr. Rain Paulson, who's the Director of Coordination Division at OCHA. So over to you, Rain.
Karen, thank you so much, and welcome colleagues to the Connecting Business Initiative session on private sector engagement in disease outbreaks and multi-hazard scenario planning. This session is organized by Connecting Business Initiative, which, as many, if not most of you may know, is a joint initiative of OCHA and UNDP as part of the Humanitarian Networks and Partnership Week, or the HNPW, which is co-chaired by OCHA and the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, SDC. So thank you very much for joining us. We're looking forward to the discussion today. Throughout today's session, if I could just run through a couple of very quick housekeeping issues to facilitate our discussions, would really appreciate, colleagues, if you could keep in mind the following. We have muted remotely the microphones of all participants by default to avoid any unnecessary noise or audio disruptions. But we do want to have as much of an open forum space as possible today with our key speakers and leaders from the business networks that are joining us. So if you do have questions, kindly click on the Q&A icon that you should see in the Zoom webinar panel, and your screens indicate to which speaker you would like to address a question, and we will do our best to moderate through the discussion. And I should say, we do have just 45 minutes for our dialogue today. If there are any unanswered questions that you've posed, we will forward those separately to the speakers for their replies and circle back with you by email through the link on the registration page. So that was a little bit of housekeeping. Now on to the substance of our discussions today. So the focus again really is on this key question around enhancing, strengthening, facilitating private sector engagement in multi-hazard scenario preparedness and response planning. We all have lived through this last year. 2020 has been an experience when countries around the globe have been responding actively to the pandemic, putting in place the necessary epidemic control measures with all sorts of consequences and implications, whether those be border closures or other measures that are put in place. But of course, concurrently, unfortunately, and in some cases tragically, we've seen other disasters superimposed on this pandemic reality. So whether that has been the Category 5 cyclone in Vanuatu, or Tropical Storm Laura in Haiti, or indeed the the major earthquake that hit the western part of Turkey, governments, civil society, businesses, business partners have had to find a way to respond in the midst of a pandemic. So emergency response to simultaneous events proved even more difficult this year than in previous years. All of which underscores just how important it is for us to look at how we constantly, continually assess emergency response capabilities and existing multi-hazard scenario planning to address these situations. So I think the context of this year situates our conversation today with the colleagues that have joined us perfectly for dialogue. So to formally start our discussion, let me introduce colleagues to you, the 3 panelists. I'll introduce them one by one, and as part of our introductions, we've asked our panelists to share some opening comments in the space of a handful of minutes around key lessons that they have seen related to emergency preparedness and response this year. So I'll introduce one by one, stopping at each one, giving an opportunity then for introductory comments. But in background, let me just say that our first panelist is Glenn Craig, who is the chairperson of the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council, the CBi member network in Vanuatu. Glenn also serves as the managing partner of a specialist South Pacific advisory firm, Pacific Advisory, and director of Konsiki Finance. Glenn, a citizen of Vanuatu, has, of course, extensive private sector background and experience related to climate finance, policy development, tourism, agriculture, as well as other industries. All of this, of course, linked with practical hands-on knowledge of the intricacies of the region, sitting on numerous private and public boards and committees in the country. So very happy to have you with us, Glenn. Colleagues, please welcome Glenn to our discussion. And Glenn, I'd like to give you the opportunity for some initial thoughts from your side on the experience of this year. Over to you, please.
Thanks, Ren. Very generous opening. Thanks, everyone. As pointed out, I'm the chairman of the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council in Vanuatu, which is, we're a standing committee of the Vanuatu Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and we were established in 2017. We were just a year after the CBi network was originally formed. And we're there to engage and promote and strengthen the mobilisation of the private sector to support the country and the government to meet its humanitarian response needs, and also its climate change objectives. We have a dual purpose organisation. Now, Vanuatu, just if you don't know, has a population of around 300,000 people. We've got 83 islands, and we're about 1,800 kilometres to the east of Australia. We're a rarity. We're one of the few countries in the world without any confirmed cases of community transmission of COVID-19. And up until just recently, we've only got 3 cases that have been recorded in quarantine at the border. So we were quite lucky that way. Because of COVID, and which is what we're here to talk about and responding under these types of conditions, we closed all of our borders on March the 19th in 2020. Unfortunately, we had tropical TC Harold cyclone hit us. It was a Category 5 cyclone, and it hit us on Monday, the 6th of April 2020. And the scale and impact of it was pretty impressive. We had 160,000 people that were affected, and it was very reminiscent of the famous Cyclone Pam that happened some 5 years ago. We were the first country in the world to respond to a natural disaster under COVID conditions. And it would be fair to say that no responders globally, internationally, or locally had actually thought how they would respond under these conditions. So it was challenging. Bear in mind that this happened with the border closure, that the diplomatic missions, most of the volunteers and many of the technical advisors were recalled before the borders closed. So not only did that mean that we didn't have international assistance that could come in, but it meant a lot of the international assistance that had been here had left. So it was very much a locally driven response. The VBRC was already activated for the COVID response, and we'd arranged into our cluster systems in late February. In contrast to previous responses, local communities, local leaders and civil society organisations had to be better prepared, and they were better prepared and more involved in this response, and that was clear to see coming through. In the after action survey that was taking place afterwards, only 6% of interviewees across the international and national spectrum thought that our response is timely. And what we got from that is that we just weren't prepared at the time. That was what we found. We weren't prepared to know how we were going to deal with it. We hadn't thought about it with the border closures. So VBRC was a critical component in the response during this time because we provided a lot of the resources. So whether or not it was the aviation assets, it was the shipping, it was the boating, it was the distribution of food aid. The VBRC distributed 35 tonnes of food. Through all of that, the private sector had a very big part to play because of the localization effect that was there. Afterwards, what we did learn is that it's likely that because of the reduction in international response capacity, that we have to learn to do it another way. And that means that the national actors have to be willing to address these problems and engage with the private sector and learn to respond to humanitarian events in a different way to what we have done in the past, especially in the SIDS, where we have depended a lot internationally. So the private sector is going to play an extremely strong role in the future in responding to a humanitarian event, and especially while we're under these types of conditions. I look forward to answering your questions and talking with the rest of the participants. Thanks, Ren.
And thank you so much for those initial reflections on the experience of your network and community for this year in response to Tropical Cyclone Harold. And we'll indeed be coming back and unpacking a bit more of the lessons learned and experiences subsequently. Thank you. So our second panelist, colleagues, today is Fania Christelle Joseph, who is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Risk Management and Business Continuity, AJEDCA, and the focal point for CBI in Haiti. Fania is also a professor of entrepreneurship at Collège Quatre-Pressoir and president of Combi pour changer la vie Timonio, an organization that supports orphans and needy children in Haiti. Chantal has worked for several years at the Association of Industries of Haiti as a communication officer and also as a marketing consultant with the Postal Office of Haiti. So we're very happy to have Chantal with us. Welcome you to our panel discussion today, and keen for some introductory remarks on lessons, reflections from your side on the Tropical Storm Laura experience in COVID-19 in Haiti. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rain, for your kind presentation and your time. It's a very great pleasure for me to be there with you all, and I welcome everyone to this session. As Rain said earlier, I'm Christelle Fania Joseph, the Executive Director of AJEDCA. AJEDCA means Alliance for Risk Management and Business Continuity. AJEDCA is the representative of the private sector and the civil society in the National System of Risk Disaster Management in Haiti. It is also the focal point of CBI and ARISE and Haiti. Additionally, we're part of the National Emergency Center of Operation called COON in Haiti. AJEDCA supports this emergency center by giving them assistance from the private sector at all times. As an example, for Hurricane Laura and COVID-19, AJEDCA supported the center by opening 2 lines for the facilitation of the communication throughout the hurricane season and free telephone communication, as well as free and unlimited internet connection. We also distributed credit on the phone of the various agents in the sector. We had on several occasions sent more than 3 million text messages to the population's cellular devices to facilitate prevention during the emergency. In short, I can say that the result has been positive, since a good part of the communities have highlighted the prevention measure that we have taught them. For COVID-19, for example, we noticed several months later the generalized use of several sanitary kits that we had distributed to the national territory. On the other hand, when Hurricane Laura was supposed to hit the north of Haiti, the whole country was set in motion and the forecast was already in place in case the cyclone changed its direction, which really happened. So to promote the private sector engagement in humanitarian action, AJEDCA operates at 2 levels. First of all, normally it identifies companies, in particular its members, which can provide products doing humanitarian action. In addition, it also promotes companies to humanitarian actors. In time of crisis, it coordinates the intervention of the private sector with the general direction of civil protection. On the other hand, we have many constraints. First, we have too many overcrowded community and building in a red zone, lack of awareness campaign aimed at making the private sector more involved in humanitarian action, failure of law enforcement authorities, lack of regularity in simulation exercises, lack of risk mitigation measures, lack of resources like human, material, financial, and too many non-functional temporary existence of the national system of risk disaster management in Haiti, the existence also of an alliance for the private sector, which is AJERCA, and we work closely with this system, and the existence also of several institutions that's very involved in this field. And we also have a very good amount of projects working like on the DRR sector, and also multi-agency and multi-sectoral coordination. Thank you very much, Rain. It's a pleasure for me to be there with you all.
Vanya, thank you so much. And both you and Glenn have done a number of things to frame the discussion well. I think highlighting the unique and particular vantage point that your organizations and your networks role that can be played is, I think, indispensable. And these, practical, pragmatic reflections on just what's required to connect the different stakeholder dots is key. So we're also looking forward to coming into and unpacking this in a little bit more detail with you subsequently, Fania, as well. So colleagues online, our third panelist joining us today is currently the Secretary General of Turkonfed, or the Turkish Enterprise and Business Confederation, which is a non-governmental business organization aiming to contribute to the development of regional, sectoral, and national economic policies. We're very happy to have with us Arda Batu, who since 2014 has managed, promoted, and advanced Turkonfed's strategic interest. Mr. Batu also serves as an independent board member at Federal Mogul Izmit Piston, on the executive board of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, as well as the advisory board on Co-Opinion and the editorial board of the Turkish Policy Quarterly. So we're very pleased also to have Arda, you with us today, and look forward to your initial comments, thoughts, reflections on lessons from the recent earthquake experience in Turkey. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's really great pleasure to be amongst you. I wish it would have been in Geneva as it used to be in prior years, but nevertheless, it's great to interact and to share experiences here. I've already learned so much from Glenn's and Fania's experiences, and I'm looking forward to interacting further in this panel and beyond. As you have succinctly noted, Turkonfed, Turkish Enterprise and Business Confederation, is a confederation of businesses that is comprised of 270 NGOs, independent NGOs beneath it. So we serve essentially as an umbrella organization representing the Turkish private sector. We are non-partisan, and we take pride in being non-partisan. And as you again have noted, we try to help private sector engagement in national development and regional development issues. And that brings me to our engagement with CBi. We're relatively newcomer to CBi. It's been, I think, just over 2.5 years now. And we have learned plenty from all the other national experiences, and still trying to learn. And the more we learn, the more we understand that there's so much more to learn, which is scary, of course, but we need to persevere, especially now that Glenn has also mentioned they were kind of suffering within a disaster during COVID times. And same experience in Turkey also. We have, just as we were struggling with the COVID situation, we had 2 earthquakes, one on the eastern part in a city called Elazığ, and as you mentioned, Rain, another one on the western coast, which is an industrially quite a developed city, which is Izmir. Now, you asked about the lessons learned. One of the critical lessons that we learned from, especially the from the Elazığ experience, was that the mobilization, as much as it seemed like a very strong mobilization effort from the private sector as well as from the public sector, we found out very soon enough, and sad to find out, that the mobilization was not smart. What do I mean by that? There was plenty of aid going to the region, especially in terms of foods, but soon enough we saw that there was an oversupply and a lack of coordination in the aid that it was going to the into the region. And this, of course, as a confederation that is also focusing on SME development, we will start to see that the local businesses were hurt tremendously. Of course, as a confederation of businesses, we focus on more the economic side of disasters as opposed to the humanitarian side. Now, I'm proud to say that in Turkey, the humanitarian aid and the humanitarian support from the government is quite strong. As most of you know, Turkey is an earthquake-prone country all across, all the way from east to west, and especially Istanbul, where our headquarters as the Confederation is situated. Istanbul is an earthquake region, and the majority of the Turkish industry is, of course, in Istanbul, with its ports. It's situated between Asia and Europe and so forth. So this, of course, puts a lot of burden on the shoulders of institutions such as Turconfed. Another lesson learned was that the private sector needs to internalize the natural disaster issue more. I mean, I think we need to understand as Turconfed, and this is an area where we're trying to create awareness, and I'm happy to explain further on some of the ongoing projects, is to create awareness on the private sector side on the urgency of addressing these issues. In Turkey, of course, the humanitarian aid is strong from the government side, but I think the private sector also needs to take responsibility. Now, we've seen some good signals coming out from both the Turconfed constituency as well as from our member associations. Some of our associations have formed special committees addressing natural disasters and how to coordinate from the private sector together with the local governments as well as the central government on natural disasters. So these are some of the positive things that we're seeing, and a lot more work needs to be done, of course, and I'm happy to elaborate more on that. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much for those initial reflections. I think all three of you have touched on really key points around what can be done in advance. How can we improve and strengthen the coherence between these different constituencies? How can we work on enhanced approaches to forward thinking through preparedness, but using a different approach than we've used in the past, where we have different constituencies perhaps siloed in a way which just simply doesn't make real world sense. And I think all of your reflections on this, supporting businesses also to internalize the realities and essentially provide this sort of connection and translation function in terms of how communities interact, is so indispensable in the role that each of you play. And so, colleagues online, you've been hearing already from this very rich experience over the last year. We're looking forward to now jumping into even more detail and having our panelists unpack more. So I'm going to go back to each of you, if I may, Glenn and Fanny and Adu, with some specific questions. And I see already we're starting to have participants online asking questions, and our CBi Secretariat colleagues are going to help us channel those, and we'll come back to those. Subsequently and address as many as time allows. So, firstly, Glenn, maybe I could come back to you. I mean, you were reflecting on some of the experiences now with on Tropical Cyclone Harold. I mean, maybe just to come back again on what you and your partners, stakeholders felt were the major challenges in terms of emergency response coordination, and reflections based on that in terms of what concretely, specifically would help improve the engagement between private sector, humanitarians, and governments, reflecting on the response that you had in Harold. So over to you, Glenn. Looking forward to your thoughts.
Appreciate that. As the rest of the CBi team know, I'm a Kiwi by birth. I lived in Vanuatu 16 years, so I'm brutally honest. So I'll try and engage as much as I can on factual things that can help. In the current times, it's slightly that with the reduction in the international response capacity, right? That's contributed to, that will be a fast lower response time in terms of a multi-hazard scenario. And with the restrictions that have been imposed on supplies and travel as a result of COVID-19, it's going to have a much more significant impact on timelines in terms of response. So we're still not out of the woods yet in terms of typhoon, cyclone season, hazard season now. We've still got another 3 weeks left to run in Vanuatu, and we're still under border restrictions. So I think COVID-19 is going to long-term affect the way that humanitarian sector operates in not just Vanuatu, but the South Pacific. even once restrictions are lifted. And it's going to empower the national and local humanitarian communities to move the power and resources here from perhaps the international response. With us at VBRC, the Resilience Council, I think we're going to have to help the National Disaster Management Office to highlight its weaknesses and response capacity. So it's unlikely that any NDMO can respond to a multi-hazard scenario in a small island country like us. So, and when the borders are closed, think of the private sector as the plan B. So no matter how organized the NDMO are, they're going to need us. And we were in a situation after TC Herald when the donor partners were funding the international NGOs to respond, but the international NGOs, 3 of them, for example, their head of countries had left Vanuatu, weren't here. They'd been pulled out with the border closure. So they were lacking some capacity to deal with that. So they were coming for Vanuatu, coming to the VBRC to respond, to help respond in the response, but they couldn't pass funding on to us. So we need to address that gap and have MOUs in place between the international NGOs. And we also need to have that in place with the international donor partners. And remember that the private sector has an incredibly important role to play in terms of first response. And we hear it time and time again, especially from the international partners, they want a localization policy. They need to bear in mind that in most instances, the first responders are the private sector. So the private sector is always willing to throw its hat in the ring and do as much as it can for free or at cost, but it needs to be organized. And this is where the Connecting Business Initiative and the whole philosophy behind organizations come together, that there's an empowering organizing institution that does that. And that needs to be recognized by our partners. And when that's recognized, then we've got the funding there to respond. We can be better prepared, we can respond faster, and then we can recover quicker in our communities. So it just makes economic sense to pass that to us.
Just unmute myself. You'd think after a year of lockdown, the unmute button was something I was very familiar with, but apologies, Glenn. Thank you for those reflections. And I think, one of the many good points you made there around, how can we support structures and systems so that when some of our traditional tools or some of our traditional partners or some of the components of the system aren't available in the way that we've been used to them being available in the past, that an effective response is still delivered, relying more fully on including on private sector actors and different stakeholders that are present, I think is key. If we have time later, I'd like to come back to comments you made before around how we can maybe enhance and strengthen our preparedness planning in light of some of the learning that's gone through here. But let's, with your permission, I'm going to move on. And Fania, if I could come back to you, very interested to hear some further reflections from your side on good practices, perhaps, that AJOCA members demonstrated in terms of business continuity, operational resilience during the pandemic and Tropical Storm Laura, and any sort of lessons you'd like to share perhaps with government and humanitarian partners in particular, based on that experience of your network members. So over to you, please, Fanny.
Yes, thank you very much, Rain, for your question. I can say that as a private sector network, we have noted several good practices with AJOCA's members, companies, on the business continuity point of view, and as well as on operational resilience, especially during the epidemic. Among the most remarkable, we can highlight the distribution of adequate equipment to facilitate teleworking. For example, Digicel, which is one of our members, has invested more than $300,000 for the purchase of solar panel, laptops, and other equipment to facilitate teleworking with a large part of their employees. We also have to notice an interest in promoting the early warning system in companies. To conclude, I can say that these cultures are very widespread in Haiti at a business level. This therefore introduced the culture of risk into a daily life of private sector companies in Haiti. So more and more, AJOCA is trying to work with their members so we can have the business continuity plan activate, and we can do like simulation exercises so they can be prepared for like any type of disasters. Thank you.
Fania, thank you so much. And I think interesting to see how we can, how we can leverage what businesses are doing for their own business continuity operations, perhaps then in terms of avenues and opportunities to support continuity of wider response activities. And so great to hear some of those reflections. Again, as time allows, Fania, maybe we'll come back again and look at this question around enhancing collaboration between the private sector, the government, and humanitarians in Haiti, and any specific suggestions and reflections you have in that regard. But with your permission, I'm now going to move on and back to Arda for another question. So recognizing that every context is, of course, different, unique sets of stakeholders, unique compositions of resources, it'd be very interesting to hear from you, Arda, more about with a view on your confederation of enterprises and businesses helping to support disaster preparedness and resilience. What were the major types of requests from government or from humanitarian actors that came to your stakeholders, to the business community, requests in terms of how to improve the way we were working together to improve emergency preparedness and response? What could you share about that, please?
Sure. One of the main requests was actually for us to coordinate among and between sectors. As you know, Turkey is one of the, we're in the top 20 developed economies globally. So we have some huge companies from, you name it, the telecom, finance, energy. So these are sectors that obviously are very important for natural disasters. But what was lacking, and from our constituency, from 2 confed members, was that there was a lack of dialogue between the sectors. So together with our now long-standing partner, UPS, which is, as I understand, is also a long-standing partner of the CBi network, we have concerted a number of workshops wherein all of these sector leaders, not only at the technical level, but also from the C-level had partaken in these workshops. And now we're trying to construct a master plan, so to speak, so as when a disaster hits, especially now looking at the Istanbul earthquake, when the Istanbul earthquake hits, we have a master plan, so to speak, that would facilitate the interaction between the sectors. This was an important component that was missing. So this finding was important for us, and now we're working hardly on this issue. Another tool that I can mention as maybe a best practice from especially the Elazığ earthquake, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, the earthquake on the eastern part of Turkey, was as simple as it sounds. The situation reports that we composed turned out to be of key importance. And what do I mean by situation reports? A report that actually has quite succinct information on the humanitarian issues on the ground, as well as on the economic issues, and as pertaining, as I said in my earlier opening comments, was on the lack of coordination between local government, central government, and the private sector. So once we pinpointed these missing links, so to speak, then we were able to address them. So as simple as it sounds, we had a small team, going into on the ground in Elazığ as well as in Izmir, and the findings of that team was key in the coordination between these parties. And there's some more, but I'll stop there in view of the time constraint.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Arda. And so, Arda, Glenn, and Fania, you'll see already we're starting to have some questions coming in from colleagues online in the chat. So I'd like to move to some of those, and maybe if I can actually come straight back to you, Arda, with one of the first questions that's come through. It's from participant Richard Veka. So the question is specifically is, one of your reflections was on inefficiencies of resource allocation. And Mr. Veka is interested in hearing from you whether Turconfed had any specific reflections as to how private sector partners might improve these inefficiencies. Any thoughts you could share on that?
Yeah, we had some hard discussions on that. In fact, even we discussed whether Turconfet should be one of the distributing or allocating actors. We for a long list of reasons we decided not to. But certainly, when a disaster takes place, our phones, our phones are ringing, especially the management of the Confederation, on where to and how to help the region. There are some public authorities that are active in this area, but I think maybe the private sector should also partake and help in the allocation. What we did over there was, especially among the actors that we have strong dialogue with, including the private and the public sector, was to at least give the message, as I said, through the situation reports, was to say stop. Stop sending this or that. You're hurting the local economy and so forth. Our role over there was not so in the coordination, but at least giving some of the key information that was needed in the coordination. But this is an area that needs to be addressed further. We're still having dialogues internally on whether our confederation can be active in this area. But as I said, it was too chaotic, so to speak, for us to play an active role in the previous disasters.
Excellent. Thank you for those reflections back, Arda. Maybe Glenn, if I could turn to you next with another one of the questions that's come in. There's a comment here from Maximilian Löffel. Glenn Craig clearly stressed that businesses are eager to help, but must be coordinated. On which basis or based on what agreement do you usually operate with business partners if you aim to coordinate a response? So I guess this is specifically in the Vanuatu context. Could you maybe share a bit more about how it functions in practice within Vanuatu in terms of the coordination with business partners?
Yep, absolutely. So we operate on a cluster system, very much like UNDP responds to as well, not just. So we have our clusters broadly the same, whether or not it's telecommunications, the WASH cluster, we have logistics, shipping. So what we try and do is make sure that we have on the executive of our organization, we make sure that each of the organizational executives come from one of those sectors, so that we've got that expertise at our board level. So that's very important, so that the people within our organization have an understanding if it's where to transition aircraft to, or there's a cyclone coming, so shipping needs to be moved there, so they can coordinate better with their government counterpart. So we make sure that's done. The other thing is to keep an active register of businesses. I can't say that more powerfully. You must keep an active register of the businesses that are willing, ready, and able to respond. And I think a good example of this within the CBi network, the gold star is PDRF in the Philippines. So they know where all the resources are at any one time. So when you know who your resources are, what their capacity is, it's a lot easier. And then you have people within your organization that have just, you might have someone from the trucking industry that sits on your board, or someone from the telecommunications. We have 2 telecommunications reps, because it's a critical part with 83 islands to make sure that we can have our cellular networks up quite fast and ready to respond. So those are the key things that I'd do. Have organized by clusters. That's good. That's globally accepted. And then make sure that you keep a really good record, an excellent record of the databases of your businesses. And it's easier in a small country with only 300 people. And I know, like my colleagues in Ada in Turkey, where they've got millions of people and hundreds of thousands of businesses. But if they start building that database, when you've got that database there, it's invaluable for your response.
Great. Again, I think these reflections on all those things that can usefully and productively be done in advance to enable an effective response when it happens are obviously indispensable. So with those responses, I'd like, if I could, Fania, to turn to you. There's also a question that's come in for which it'd be great if you could give some reflections based on the particular experience and role of Adjerka. So over to you for some further reflections, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Rain. Thank you for the question. So I would say that Adjerka really work with the government through the Directorate of Civil Protection. We work with them not only on the response, but also on the coordination and most likely on the prevention, awareness, and the response. So usually, for example, if we have like a hurricane or any type of disaster, Adrika, like way before, for example, on the hurricane, we also coordinate with them on, first of all, we plan with them an awareness campaign right before like the hurricane, for example, and then we coordinate with the communities also during the disaster, and after the disaster, usually on the response also Adrika intervene also in the response with the Directorate of Civil Protection. So we work closely also with the businesses, especially with our members, so they can have, like I said earlier, so they can have their contingency plans, since we know that Haiti is a very vulnerable country. We have so many earthquakes, so many hurricanes every year, and all type of disasters. On top of that, we also have the social political situation, which is very complicated, especially the last few years. So it's very important for the private sector to have their contingency planning and up to date. So that's one of the reasons why also we try to do the simulation exercises with them. We try to work with them, like giving them some workshop all the time, and also promote the awareness campaign to their employees and to the community in general. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fania. And one of the interesting elements and strengths of CBi, I know, is looking precisely at this slightly different experience that we have in different contexts where networks operate, and yet there are commonalities of experience and which lead, I think, to some important possible recommendations on areas that we collectively need to keep prioritizing and strengthening. So I feel bad that we have to keep pushing this discussion along, but we have just 5 minutes left for the budgeted time of the webinar today. And I wanted to give each of the panelists a chance maybe to come back with literally in 60 seconds, what is sort of the one concrete call, ask that you would insist that we should learn, look at, and act on together based on this experience of the last year? What would you really put forward as sort of the headline message? And Glenn, I'll go back to you first, and then to Fania, and then to Ada, if I could.
Thanks, Rain. For me, it's building on the localization policy. Localization, use the private sector. We're here, we're responding, we're in the communities. We live in the communities, our teams, ourselves, our families, we're all here. So we know it, we know the languages, and we're there ready to respond. So if we've learned anything from the international border closures, it's time to transition to in-country responses and using in-country resources where possible, and enabling those local communities, businesses, the private sector to be able to effectively respond when needed. And we're there to support the government response. That's what we're there to do, and looking forward to engaging more with our donor partners to be recognised accordingly. That'll be a huge step for us.
Very good. So I think, this call to actually delivering the transformation towards localization based on the experience of this last year, that message is a powerful one. Thank you. Glenn, what would be, Fania, your one headline message out of the experience of this year?
Thank you very much, Rain. So I would say that the existence of Adrika is an inescapable asset for the implementation of the following. First of all, fully involve the private sector in disaster risk reduction, facilitate the creation of sectoral crisis units, pooling these platforms, and real-time sharing of useful information and sharing of useful information in real time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Another compelling argument for how we can improve the way we work. Thank you, Fania. Ada, what is your main headline message?
I would say we need to change the mindset and culture from maybe more competitive to cooperative culture in terms of dealing with natural disasters, especially among the actors involved, private sector, public sector, and within the public sector, of course, between local government and central government. This is key. I think it touches on almost every issue that we have addressed today during this webinar. And second, the COVID, of course, creates a new environment that is challenging. And especially there was a question pertaining to SMEs, which I won't elaborate on too much, but I'll just say this. It's very difficult for SMEs that are actually the backbone of the economies, I think, all across the globe. And it's very difficult to have them listen to these, preparedness issues, business continuity issues during a time of economic crisis. But I think, again, through a maybe cooperative and concerted effort, we can maybe push to have the SMEs listen and be more prepared for future disasters. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I think this top line advocacy around cooperation rather than competition and looking at how we can leverage respective strengths is a really powerful message out of that. Thank you. So listen, colleagues, just a few final thoughts as we wrap up the webinar today. So just to say, I think from everything that we've heard, we've underscored again just how important it is to, in order to continue to promote risk-informed decisions and investments, to actively involve businesses from the outset in national disaster risk management, not just operations, but planning processes and frameworks. I think this strong call from the outset to involve the key stakeholders of the businesses is a compelling one. So a need clearly to engage industry leaders and key officers from the private sector throughout. We do need to look at how we can do more joint planning activities. Others' language here around collaboration and cooperation rather than competition, I think, is key, and to use that to refine and enhance contingency plans, programs, and activities. From what our colleagues online have shared, the panelists with their rich experience, we've seen again this year just how important this is and why it's so critical for us as we move forward. So I hope those that have joined online have found this as informative and enlightening as I have, as we've together reflected on how we can improve current coordination mechanisms, our emergency preparedness, and our response capabilities by adopting this multi-stakeholder approach. And I would just like to offer a deep gratitude and warm thanks to our panelists, to Glenn, to Fania, and to Ada for this insightful discussion. Colleagues, there were some questions that came in online that we weren't able to answer live, but as I said at the top of the webinar, we will be following up separately by email. So thank you very much. Warm thanks, Ada, Fania, and Glenn, and wishing all of our participants a good rest of your day wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rain.
45 minutes is not a long time.
Thanks, Rain.
A pleasure. Well prepared. It's like it feels like a starter course for a nice meal. You know, we just have 45 minutes, we touch on some issues, and that's it. Anyway, leave them wanting more is a good way to go. Thanks for all the preparation on this. Well done, you guys. Great work.
Yeah. All thanks to
Take care.
Rizo for this one. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for helping us.